This is a story of who we were, where we came from, and how we came to be who and where we are now. A story that can only be told because our grandparents and many in their extended families were forced by a rising and recurrent tide of oppression and persecution that our Jewish ancestors finally found had become intolerable. Forced to abandon their homes and livelihoods, they set out on a dangerous journey to an unknown destination and an uncertain outcome. From the comfortable vantage point of the early 21st century, it's hard to imagine how they managed it, survived and thrived, and also that you and I, their unborn children, could aspire to lives of freedom, equality, and eventually prosperity. I'm Geoff Lucas, the great-grandson of one of those ancestors, and this little family history video is a time capsule, a message in a bottle perhaps, for you, our not-so-distant relatives across the world, and for your children and their children. But at its heart, it's simply a story of just three people who connect us all. Nathan Lubelsky, Jacob Lubelsky, and Lubelsky-Londinsky, born Zelda Lubelsky. And although their story is not unusual among thousands of similar stories, it is ours and has its own particular characteristics. Hardships, escapes, fearful journeys, plans that went wrong, separations that stretched for decades. But ultimately, it's about people who persevered, who tried to make the best of the hand that life had dealt them, and demanded the right to a future. Our handed-down family stories and the limited official records we can find take us back as far as a 19th century shtetl, the Yiddish name for village. Shtetl in the province of Grodno was a small, mostly Jewish market town that has had 3 mother countries and a dozen different spellings. Today it's part of the Republic of Belarus, but in the years our family lived there, it was still within the Empire of Russia. There were about 700 Jews in the town then, over 70% of the total population. Somehow they squeezed into one synagogue to pray and sent their children to one small school to study the Torah. Shtetl was in an area that was known as the Pale of Settlement, a restricted zone between modern-day Poland and Belarus, where Jews were permitted to live, but not to live too well. They were barred from owning land, attending universities, or entering most of the more lucrative and influential professions. So although the shtetls developed a rich culture, most residents were very poor. Into this world, Nathan, or Nachum, his Yiddish name, was born in 1844. We believe he was the son of one Avraham and Rivka. But even to this point on our family tree, the trail is foggy. Most records, correspondence, and anecdotal evidence for Jews in the Pale, families just like ours, were lost or destroyed long ago. In fact, we can't even be certain of Nathan's surname at birth. No birth certificates from the area or the period are available at this time, and it's unlikely any survived. The earliest documents we have confirming Nachum's name is from a 1905 US census and shows it as Lubelsky. But he may have had a different one originally, or none at all. In the shtetl days, many Jews were simply known as the son of or daughter of, such as Avraham ben Yaakov. Shtetl Jews were also known by nicknames, not always so complimentary. You might know Yankel the Hunchback, Yenta the Matchmaker, or Moshe the Latrine, recognized by his body odor. Whatever his local name, it appears that Nathan grew up with two siblings, an older brother Louis and a younger sister Golda, about whom we know very little. From the scraps of information available, it seems likely that Nathan worked at first on a small agricultural collective, perhaps raising chickens and a few cows or horses, maybe growing small plots of corn and potatoes. Like most Jews in the village, he spoke Yiddish, the language of East European Jews, a colloquial mixture of German, Polish, Russian, and Hebrew. He was said to be devoutly religious, and, as expected, he took a wife from within the community, a pretty young girl named Masha. Nathan and Masha had two children, Jacob, born in 1873, and Zelda 8 years later. But then came a tragedy all too common at that time. Masha died soon after Zelda's birth. Unable to care for an infant daughter and a young son by himself, Nathan turned to a female relative, most likely an aunt or grandmother or great-aunt, to give Zelda a home. Starting around 1881, the year Zelda was born, the hard life of shtetl dwellers got even worse. The government found an excuse to further oppress the Jewish population by adding the assassination of Tsar Alexander II to their list of supposed crimes. And so began a new and particularly violent era of pogroms, essentially race riots aimed at Jews. Unofficial and just as often officially sanctioned looting, destruction and massacres struck villages with frightening regularity all across the Pale. And this began the long exodus of millions of Jews from across Eastern Europe that stretched into the 1920s. For young Jewish boys in 19th century Russia, a 12th birthday was not always a happy occasion. At that age, they were often identified, kidnapped, and drafted into the Russian army. If they survived the ordeal, they could spend decades as servants or laborers, or end up as cannon fodder. We imagine that Nathan would have tried to save his son from this fate, perhaps by arranging an escape to the west by road, train, and ship, as many other fathers would have done. Many prudent and lucky families succeeded in this way by sending their children ahead to England or America, planning to reunite later. But if Nathan and Jacob hatched such a plan, it was either prevented or delayed. An interview with Jacob's youngest daughter, Sylvia, about 100 years later, tells us Jacob did claim to have served in the Russian army, and that he contracted rheumatic fever there, which she believed may have damaged his heart.
My father left Russia. He was very glad to get out of Russia, having been in the army, with a war wound, I think, and also he had contracted rheumatoid arthritis, and in fact that probably was the reason for his early death. He didn't talk about that very much, but he was a man who was determined to make his way.
We may never know the details, but somehow, after some presumably hair-raising adventures, Jacob managed to escape. Family legend says he took the name Lubelsky from a dead soldier, acquiring his papers and somehow avoiding capture. Although as yet we do not have Jacob's name on any passenger records, we believe he reached and boarded a ship in Hamburg, Germany around 1885, a port often used by emigrating Jews. Still a young boy, perhaps he joined another Jewish family and used their name to avoid any questions from immigration officials about traveling on his own. There has been speculation that Jacob, along with others on the voyage, believed they were bound for New York. But once he landed at the London docks, he went no further. Now he was on his own, 12 years old, unable to speak English. Did he even have a few coins in his pocket to buy some food? But his situation was not unique, and there were a few volunteer efforts on hand ready to meet and assist Jewish immigrants disembarking in London by the thousands, flocking to the East End, where up to 150,000 Jews had settled. But some new arrivals without sponsors were less fortunate, often lured directly from the landing docks by sweatshop owners or others looking to exploit cheap labor. Many were then pressed into service in menial work by tradesmen and their agents, perhaps as tailors' assistants, woodworkers, or haulers, paid in housing in slum buildings, many to a room under primitive conditions. Many may have regretted leaving Eastern Europe at all. Jacob may have been luckier, possibly because of skills he picked up in the army or even earlier. It seems likely that he was apprenticed to a cabinet maker. But however he came by his trade, as we shall see later, he became a skilled and modestly successful craftsman over the next 10 years. And at the age of 26, by now well established in his trade and better able to support a family, in 1899 he married Paulina Sofa, a 19-year-old immigrant from Vilna, today's Vilnius, Lithuania. They began their married lives in a 2-room apartment above the workshop on Columbia Road, Hackney, that Jacob had set up the year before. Paulina took in sewing, while Jacob mastered his craft, at first building bedroom suites for those who could afford them. Once in their new country, many immigrants of this generation preferred to forget their difficult past and, sadly for us, did not share those experiences with their children. But this is how Jacob's daughter Sylvia described it.
Well, my father really very rarely spoke about Russia in terms of endearment, simply because he hated the anti-Semitism that was there, so rampant. In fact, it was a toss-up between Russia and Poland. They were both dreadful. Dad used to tell me about an uncle of his who lived in Kiev and who was either a cellist, I think was a cellist in the Kiev orchestra. And I think there was a bit of culture because he was very keen on education, always on education. He would have spent every penny he had for us to become cultured and to learn. But he was a great traditionalist, and he used to say to me, the one thing you must never opt out of is being a Jew. You can't opt out of that. You are born a Jew and you have to stay a Jew.
But now, from the beginning of the 20th century, let's go back to a fork in the road, back to Shchenovitsa. While Nathan must have waited anxiously for word from his son, we believe little Zelda grew up in the home of her grandmother or great-aunt, a herbalist who sold medicinal ointments. We know little of Zelda's childhood except that, according to her children, she remembered growing up on a farm. When she was about 7, her father Nathan, having lost his wife Masha, remarried in 1888 to one Zipper Mendelssohn. Within 5 years they had a son, Shulam, or Sam, who traveled with his mother to America. Later came Frank. But we have no evidence that they took Zelda back into their home. There's no telling how she was affected by living without either of her natural parents as a child, but it cannot have been terribly happy. When she was 18, Zelda married a local tailor a few years older, named Geoff Lucas, a name similar enough to Lubelsky to cause some speculation to later genealogists. But a year after their marriage, their daughter Chaya, later called Annie, was born, and Zelda's adult life begun in earnest. At some point, the family must have received word that her brother Jacob was alive and living in London, even though he may have intended, and they might have thought, he was in New York. But by then, Nathan must have known it was time to make his own plans. Perhaps he considered going to London, but for reasons we may never know, he decided to take his family to America rather than reunite with his son. If there was a plan or exchange of letters on the subject, we are unaware of their nature. But as was common practice at the time, we believe Nathan made the trip to America first to test the waters, traveling alone to New York in 1893. We assume his intention was to establish connections and earn enough money to bring over his family from Shchenovitsa. We don't know how Nathan managed, although a decade later he listed his occupation on a census form as a tailor working at home. Whatever type of work he found when he first arrived, it apparently took him 8 years to save enough. Back home, without Nathan present as head of the family, it must have been Jacob Londinsky who decided sometime in 1900 that he would emigrate ahead of the others, joining Nathan in New York to find work and lodging. A year later, Nathan and Jacob were able to send for Zipper and her son Sam, as well as Zelda with her infant daughter Chaya. They sailed to America on the Amsterdam from Holland. Conditions on the ship and the cheapest passenger quarters in steerage were usually terrible. With a young child and a 9-month-old baby, the trip had to be grueling, and not having their menfolk to help undoubtedly made it even more difficult. The world they entered through Ellis Island couldn't have been more different from the one they left. At the turn of the century, New York was a magnet for Jews escaping from the Pale, attracting far more than the number who settled in London. 1.5 million came, and by 1914 600,000 had moved into the Lower East Side, making it one of the most crowded neighborhoods in the world. The immigrants were of many nationalities, but their religion and the Yiddish language united them, like a small country within the city. In this cramped, noisy environment, Zelda and Jacob Londinsky barely scraped by. Jacob found work as a painter. Zelda had 7 more children in rapid succession, including one son who died as a toddler. Life was difficult and also crowded, with Jacob's brother Victor somehow finding a space to live in their tenement apartment too. Making matters worse, Jacob Londinsky allegedly had a volatile temper. The noise, poverty and conflict, added to the chaos of so many children and mouths to feed, must have taken a heavy toll on Zelda. In the very few pictures we have, she looks considerably older than her years. Her life took another challenging turn in 1922, when her husband Jacob, just 42, died of a disease rampant in the overcrowded community, tuberculosis. Zelda, whose youngest daughter was not yet 2, was left to struggle to support her family by running a small candy store and soda fountain. For Nathan, Zipper and their 2 sons, things were a little better. In the beginning, the Lubelsky-Londinsky families moved into the same apartment, but census records show that they later separated and lived at different addresses.
But my father, you see, I had always been the secretary for the family. I used to write all the letters for him. He used to write to his sister, who unfortunately was in rather straitened circumstances. She had 7 children. She was a widow. Her husband had died of consumption very early on after they'd got 7 children, and she had a struggle to bring them up. And they lived in Brooklyn in a 2-story house. They were on the first floor and the Italians were on the ground floor, and there were eternal battles always between these Italians and her. They used to throw orange peel over to each other and swear at each other, you see. But really I think there was no real animosity. It was just a sort of neighbourly sort of tiff. Yeah.
By 1904, when Nathan was 60 and finding it hard to secure regular employment, he was remembered as increasingly turning to religious observance in his daily routine. It was left to Zipper to keep the family afloat, and she took in work at home as a seamstress. An ocean away in London, Jacob Lubelsky was developing a reputation through dogged hard work and a successful business as a cabinet maker. Having expanded to 3 workshops and a small showroom by 1924, he was sufficiently confident to acquire an old match factory in nearby Bow and begin to build a furniture factory, at first able to accommodate over 80 workers. As Jacob's business grew, so did his family. He and Paulina had 4 children and were said to be a happy couple with everything to live for. But it was not to be for long. In 1918, shortly after giving birth to another son, Paul, Paulina died of what was called milk fever, a severe chest infection. Jacob was distraught and had to send the baby away for nearly a year to be looked after in a nursing facility. But 3 years later, in what was perhaps a fairly common occurrence when widowed parents needed help raising their children, he married a much younger widow, Polly Rosengard, whom he had met only 3 weeks earlier, and who already had a son. By the mid-1920s, they had brought 2 more children into the fold. But unlike his sister Zelda, Jacob was able to create a comfortable life for himself and his family, in a city where he may never have intended to go. And unlike his father, he was acutely anti-religion.
Daddy always used to say that he hated religion with such a terrible hatred. He thought it was the reason for most bad things that happened in the world. If there hadn't been religion, there wouldn't have been anti-Semitism, there wouldn't have been any wars and all the rest of it. He was a great humanitarian, and he loved everything to do with Israel. He belonged to Technicon. He supported the Home for Jewish Blind Babies. He helped all the Jewish charities that I can think of, as well as sundry charities for ordinary English charities. He was a great nationalist. He loved England, and he would have done anything to further its interests.
It was at least 23 years after he left Shechanovice as a boy, and possibly as many as 41 years, that Jacob finally set eyes on his father and sister again. Curiously, we found no shipping or immigration records earlier than this passenger list, which shows Jacob visited his father in 1926 with his daughter Sylvia. But even though we lack documents or photos to prove it, it is hard to imagine that he would have waited 2 more decades for a reunion. Over the years there were more visits, with Jacob bringing his older children to meet their American relatives. As his own finances were by now quite comfortable, it seems likely he would have sent money to his father and sister in New York to ease their situation. Sadly, we don't have much detailed information on the intervening years, but Nathan passed away at the ripe old age for those days of 85 in 1929. He's buried outside New York.
I thought he was a lovely old man. I've got a nice picture of him. He was a very tall and upright-looking man, very much like the Lubelskys look, but he was very tight-fisted. And I remember when I was about to go home, he made the supreme sacrifice and said he'd like to buy me a present. And so my cousin Dora, who was very outspoken at that time, she said, "I'll make the old guy pay out for this." And she bought me a little string, a 3-string row of seed pearls. I recently gave them to Jackie because I treasured them. Not that they were worth anything, but I've treasured them because they were from my grandfather.
Back in London, Jacob, his family and his business continued to prosper, until around mid-1935, when a serious freak accident at his beloved factory put him in the hospital.
I think just a year before Dad died, Dad was in the habit of going around in his shirt sleeves, looking in on all the things that were going on in every department.
And he loved it.
And at this particular
boiler.
occasion, he found himself in the boiler house, where 2 people, there was Bill Brown, the caretaker, and a porter, and they were shoveling in wood waste, which in the shape of dust, which was from the sanding machine dust, which they put into a sack. The porter, very foolishly, threw the whole sack into the boiler house with an enormous blowback, and this blowback simply took my father's hair off his arms, off his chest, off his face, all over, and a little of the porter's as well. And my father, in his quixotic way, had insisted that the porter be treated first. Although he was far more seriously burned, he insisted that they looked after the porter first. And when I got to his bedside, he said, I'd like you to tell Polly, that was Countess of Westcliffe's name, he said, I would like you to tell her that I shan't be at the Regal in Well Street, which was the cinema, where they'd had an appointment to go to a film. But he said, don't worry her, tell her I'll probably be with her tomorrow, but don't make a fuss. Well, I just couldn't believe it, because it was such a, it was, to my mind, my way of thinking, it was a heroic way to react. And I gave the message just the way I was asked to do. And of course he was in the hospital, and thank God he recovered. And I think he died within a year of that accident. And it was always my belief that that accident must have played a part in assisting his early demise.
Yeah.
Back in the US, Zelda's family continued to grow as her daughters married and had children. But another shadow was soon to fall. Her youngest son, Jaime, drowned at the age of 27 while swimming in a lake in 1940. Grief-stricken, Zelda died the following year of cancer at 60 years old, leaving her by now large family to go their own ways. Her youngest child, Marcia, moved from her mother's home to live with her older, married sister, Leslie. After Jacob and Zelda's passing, and perhaps because of the Second World War and upheavals on both continents, connections between most of the London and New York families faded. One exception was the strong tie re-established in 1938, when Jacob's eldest daughter, Millie, emigrated to the United States with her husband, Willie Schumann, and their sons, Dennis and Ronald. The Schumanns joined the extended family in New York, and even after moving to California, maintained relationships with a number of Zelda's children for the next 60 years. While several of Nathan's descendants on both sides of the Atlantic stayed in touch until the 1990s, other grandchildren and great-grandchildren didn't even realize they had close cousins across the pond. But new technologies and the era of cheap and easy communications eventually made it possible for them to connect in ways Jacob and Zelda could never have dreamed. We hope this short history of the Lubelsky-Londinsky family has given you a little more insight into your ancestors, as well as clues and sources to learn more should you wish. But it wouldn't be right to end the story without some recognition of what might have been, and what happened to so many other families just like ours. If Nathan, Jacob and Zelda hadn't dared or been forced to leave Shchenovitsa, few, if any of us, would probably be alive today. Because those of the Lubelsky and Londinsky clans who remained, and there must have been many, most likely died in the Holocaust in the 1930s and 40s. In 1941, Shchenovitsa was bombed and occupied by the Germans. Jews were once again murdered, forced into labor camps, and imprisoned in ghettos. Many more were deported to extermination camps at Treblinka and Majdanek, where most or all probably perished. So, how can we thank our ancestors for crossing a continent or an ocean, for risking everything they had so that their children and great-great-grandchildren could survive? Well, at the very least, we can remember and say their names. Thank you for watching.